So welcome to a McNally Jackson virtual event. We are so pleased that we're able to host these virtual events. One of the most exciting things about it is we're able to host authors who aren't based in New York and couldn't come into the bookstore. And tonight we have a particularly international group. We have Bénédicte Savoy, whose book we're celebrating tonight, who is zooming in from Berlin, and Aruna de Souza is zooming in from Oslo. And Bénédicte's wonderful translator, Suzanne, is zooming in from Berlin as well. So we have a very international group, which is very exciting. So as many of you know, Bénédicte's book, Africa's Struggle for Its Art, is a major new history of how African nations, starting in the 1960s, sought to reclaim the art looted by Western colonial powers. Bénédicte is a professor in the Department of Art History at the Technical University of Berlin and was a professor at the Collège de France in Paris from 2016 to 2021. She is the co-editor of Translocations, Histories of Dislocated Cultural Assets, Acquiring Cultures, Histories of World Art on Western Markets, and the museum is open towards a transnational history of museums. She is the author with Felwine Zaire of The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage Towards a New Relational Ethics, known as the Savoy Report. She lives in Berlin. And she is in conversation tonight with Aruna de Souza, who is currently the Edmund J. Safra Visiting Professor at the National Gallery of Art and a contributor to the New York Times and 4 Columns. Her forthcoming collection of the writings of Lyndon Nolchin, Making It Modern, which she edited, will be released in March 2022. She was awarded the Rabkin Prize for Arts Journalism in 2021. So before I hand over to Aruna and Bénédicte, I wanted to just remind everyone that we are going to have time for questions at the end of tonight. So feel free to drop any questions you have in the Zoom chat, and we'll be sure to get to them. All right, I'll hand over to you, Aruna.
Thank you so much. And thanks to McNally Jackson and to you, Michaela, for inviting me to be in conversation with Bénédicte. I obviously have known very much of her work and the impact that it's had on the European kind of renewed attention towards questions of restitution after, decades and decades of African activists raising the issue over and over. And so it's been especially interesting to read Africa's Struggle for Its Art and really learn about the prehistory of the current moment. So I guess just to start out, Bénédicte, I would love for you to just talk about what, how this book took shape and how it developed out of your work with the Savoy Report.
Thank you, Aruna, for this question. I'm very happy to be here, delighted to be here. I'm in Zurich right now, you are in Oslo, and we have Susanne Meyer-Abich, who is a translator. She's in Berlin. It's very international now. And yes, the question about the birth of this book is very connected with a report that I wrote with my colleague Felwine Zaire from Senegal. It was an invitation by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, to think about the first step, to think about the possibility or the ways to give back the cultural heritage from Africa, only from Africa. It was our mission, that is in French national collections. And doing that with Felwine Zaire, we had a lot of very strong experiences. One of them was a physical experience to improve the absence of cultural heritage. On one day, we were in Cotonou, in Benin, in the Republic of Benin. It's a little country between Nigeria and Togo. And on a Thursday, we were in Abomey and in the palace of the royal palace of Abomey, and it was completely empty because the assets from there, the royal objects, are for 130 years in Paris. And at the next time, after a flight, night flight to Paris, at the next day at 9 a.m., we had an appointment in the Musée du Quai Branly. It's an ethnological museum in Paris, and we saw the objects there. And it was a very, very, very yeah, I would say existential experience of absence and presence of cultural heritage, absence at the proper natural location, and presence in Paris, in this former colonial capital. But we had also one very existential, and for me as an historian, maybe more existential experience. It was an intellectual experience in archives. We had the idea at the beginning with Felwine Sarr that we could be able to find a lot of piles of claims of restitution letters from the past, and the very first idea was, okay, we will go to archives in Paris, to the museum archives, we will find such piles of claims, and we will recommend Emmanuel Macron to answer these letters. And we went to archives, we looked after, or we searched very intensively such letters, and we didn't find letters. What we found was maybe more shocking. We found piles of articles from the 70s and for the early 80s, from the time when Felwine and myself, we were children. And all these archives suggested that the debate about the restitution of cultural heritage from Europe to Africa had already been done in the 70s. Not only that, we found a report like our reports by a former president of the Musée du Louvre, a very respected scholar, and he wrote, it was 1981, that it would be very an act of solidarity and equity to give back the assets, the objects from Africa. And I was, I don't know if it's an English word, I was tetanized, I was petrified to notice that all the work that we were doing had already been done. And for me, it was the beginning of a systematical research on these first conversation on restitutions in Europe. I went to Berlin archives, to the archives of the Foreign Office in Berlin, etc., etc. And in London, in Brussels, and I found more and more and more and more material, even in the so-called, at that time, mass medias like TV and yes, at the BBC or at ZDF, German TV programs, huge programs with this topic from 81, 82, 83. And yes, it was the beginning of this book, because I thought, okay, I am confronted, I have to face double amnesia. The first amnesia is that we now, in 2021 or 2017, we have forgotten that, or museums in Europe were very keen on making forgotten that all these African, not only African, but the African collection came in the colonial time and are connected with a lot of violence, of physical violence, but also of symbolical violence. And that was completely unsaid, unknown in Europe for 10 years ago or 5 years ago, a complete colonial amnesia. But we had a second amnesia about this first debate from the 80s. And for me, it was important to reconstruct why it didn't work at that time, because they did a lot of steps in order to restitute, and I think France and Germany was short before the moment when they could given back.
They stopped short, yeah.
Yes, and it didn't work. And my question was why? Why? What was the problem, or why didn't this project stop? Why did it stop? And why it's forgotten? Why Felwin and myself, and also Emmanuel Macron and staff and all his advisors, etc. Nobody knows 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that this first debate has taken place in the 80s. So it was the reason, and yes.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things that's, to me, most fascinating about the book, is that the way that you lay out all of this stuff that you found in the archives, that it's not at all just about a kind of passive forgetting, but that these museum heads of museums and curators and cultural ministers and all sorts of people, both from the political side, but also from the art history side and from the museum side, were actually involved in sometimes quite shocking kinds of strategies for suppressing the conversation and for stopping it before it could even happen in some cases. And this is what I found, one of the things that I found so interesting is the strategies that these museum people involved in these debates were, on the European side, were often taking part in order to kind of just just cut things off at the pass, as one says in American English, make it impossible to kind of go forward.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that what you describe is one of the most important discoveries, the complete the big no or yet to the aims of the new independent countries of Africa. The other discovery, and it's that we had the impression in the last 5 years in Europe, we heard a lot that the restitution debate is something for woke European people, young people, politically correct people, etc. And the truth is that all this debate came from Africa at the very beginning. It's not an idea of bored Europeans. It came from Africa, from a lot of circles in Africa, from political circles, from poets, filmmakers, etc. And immediately after the independences, 1960, 65, you can find the first manifestos about give us our art of works back. I think especially about one very strong article. It's a declaration of war, quasi, by Paulin Joachim. He was a Beninese journalist in Dakar, 1965, and he wrote a very important piece with, I think the first sentence is, we will have to fight a very hard battle in the next decades, and it would be the battle of the restitution or recuperation of our art. And we can observe 5 or 10 years of very strong statements from Africa, and they are Pan-African statements. It's not only Nigeria being keen on doing nation building with the cultural heritage. Is a more important movement about reconnecting all the African continent with his culture, with his immaterial culture, with languages, philosophies, religions, etc., in order to become strong or very independent on autonomous countries, but also with a material heritage. In the first 15 years, you have a lot of voices, very interesting voices, And then the debate came to Europe, 73, in one precise moment, not to Europe, to the UN, to New York, and from the UN to the UNESCO. The UNESCO is in Paris, it's based in Paris, and it spread into European museums. And in this moment happened what you said, namely this solidarity among Western museums in being completely against these voices and in trying to silence the very cultural and humanistic claims from Africa. And you said, yes.
Well, I mean, the way that you laid out, like some of the strategies, right? Like one was just delay, just, kick the can down the road so that it's the next person's problem to deal with. But then I was, this idea of the list, and I in my naivete, I mean, I've been working in the art world for 30 years, but it didn't occur to me that one of the strategies that museums were using was simply not to catalog their holdings, so that these people from countries, formerly colonized countries in Africa, couldn't make their claims for restitution because there was no cataloging of the objects or their provenance. And the idea of just like, we're just not going to make the list. I mean, I was naively completely shocked at this, because it seems like such a transgression, not just a moral or ethical transgression, but a transgression of the very sort of, what the European Museum claims to do, right? Which is to have this function of being a registrar of their own objects.
To be a registrar and to be absolutely transparent. One of the functions of museums is to transmit knowledge or to produce knowledge about these collections. And yes, in fact, the museums, and particularly German museums, and that's very interesting, it was not only about not doing lists, it was, or the sources are memorandums, and in these memorandums, they advise themselves not to do lists. It's not only not to do, but it's to be proud of being intransparent. And this intransparency become one of the most effective weapon. And they speak about weapons and to be armed against Africa, to be armed against these claims. These vocabulary from the West European museums are very, military. And intransparency become a very important weapon. And I remember a quote in one of these memorandums. It's very important not to publish our catalogs, because if we published, it could wake
covetousness,
desire.
Yeah.
It could wake the desire of having back. And in German, it's Begehrlichkeiten wecken, desire, wecken, wake up, desire. And it's a very it's a huge perversity to claim to be a museum as a location for science, knowledge, etc., and a sharing of heritage on the one side, and on the other side to say, no, we stop to publish. And in the German context, in the French context, it's a little bit different, but in the German context, you can see publications until 1965, 70, publications about the African collections, and after that, nothing until now. And yes, we have a lot of fights, or we had in Berlin around the construction, the edification, and now the opening of the so-called Humboldt Forum. It's a new ethnological museum in the heart of Berlin. And at the beginning, when they opened, they didn't have lists, and online collections, etc. And it's a continuity of this strategy from the 70s. It's very surprising and shocking.
I mean, some of the, I mean, you know, again, one of the things that I think is so beautifully demonstrated in the early because the book is chronological and it's sort of organized around these sort of punctual moments, right? But one of the things that's really stands out is the ways in which for a long time, people, from the various African nations who were at the forefront of these demands to get their cultural property back, were having to become more and more kind of strategic in how they presented and when they presented their cases, because both individual European governments, but also even UNESCO and other organizations would sort of do things to kind of foreclose the conversation before it even started. And I think that there were a few moments where you sort of described different political figures and curators in Africa and how they sort of managed to negotiate around some of these roadblocks.
Yes, that's very impressive to see how, for example, the very respected archaeologist Ekpo Eyo from Nigeria in Lagos, how he tried to obtain not restitutions. At the beginning, it was he was only interested in long-term loans. And he asked in the 70s very politely, his colleagues from London and Paris and Berlin, okay, I'm a museum professional like you, and it would be a sign of solidarity from you to give us a few pieces from Benin City. Benin City was looted by the British Army in 1897, and he explained we have a few museums in Nigeria now, but we want to have one in Benin City, and for that it would be nice to have a few pieces from your huge collections in London or in Berlin. Berlin had the second biggest collection worldwide, now and had in the 70s, 60s, and it tried it very professionally, like a professional of museums, and the answers were so arrogant and so and his dignity was hurt. I think we have no notices from him, from Ekpo Eyo, saying, oh, it was very shaming the situation or mortifying or something like that, but you can reconstruct the situation when he came to Berlin and nobody was ready to receive him or to speak with him at such situations. And Ekpo Eyo was trained in Cambridge. He know all the situation, and he was very important scholar. And after that, after 10 years almost of trying to obtain loans, he said, okay, I tried something else. And this something else was to buy objects from Nigeria, from Benin City, on the art market, but not only to buy these objects, also to have a huge press campaign about this position, to have to buy your own heritage. And at Sotheby's in the early 80s, that was one of his strategies to show how Nigeria, he as a representative from Nigeria, has no other choice as to buy their own heritage. And the other strategy was to organize a huge and very now, I think now it's an iconic exhibition he curated with collection from Lagos, not from Benin City, but national collection from Lagos. He curated a tournée exhibition, and this
touring exhibition, yeah,
touring exhibition,
yeah.
And it was. This exhibition was shown in the USA, but also in the Soviet Union, in Berlin East, in France, in Zurich, etc. And this exhibition was like a claim exhibition, because in the catalog he wrote, okay, you can see a lot of things from Nigeria, and we are a museum nation, we are able to curate such a huge show, but something is missing, and that's Benin City, and it would be nice if, etc. And he used this exhibition as a huge letter or demand of restitution touring. Yeah.
He's one of the real stars, I think, of the book. You have a photograph of him at the opening of that touring exhibition, and he's such a handsome and dashing figure. I think now he's ripe for someone to make a movie about him and his strategies for kind of working around stuff that was, yeah, see, he's interesting guy. So at the same time as sort of we're reading about this prehistory and this history that has been so deeply suppressed, right? And suppressed, I think, for a variety of reasons. Early on in the book, you sort of make a comparison to the ways in which the environmental movement of the early 70s was kind of very robust, and then it kind of was sort of put to rest for a while until now it's coming up again. And so this idea of these recurrent kind of upwellings of activism around certain issues. But I think that, that your epilogue of the book is so powerful, because you really talk about why we have to be thinking about this now, and what the lessons of this earlier moment of activism need to be telling us about what an ethical position in relation to the question of restitution would be, and why it needs to be really at the forefront and an urgent issue for us. And so, how do you connect what happens in this earlier moment with today, what we need to be worrying about today?
Yes, you are right. I was very inspired by a book by Nathaniel Rich, Losing Earth. It's a book from 2019, I think. Nathaniel Rich is an essayist in New York, and he reconstructs the first climate debate exactly in the same time, and he tried to understand why it failed at that time. And I was very inspired by this book, because he was able to reconstruct lobby working, and very some gestures or activities from lobbyists that are not well documented. It's very difficult to reconstruct something that doesn't work. Yeah. And for me, it was a methodological inspiration to reconstruct something that went wrong. Yeah. And I think now the movement is something, as you described, is like a boomerang. In the 70s and 80s, the European museums took the restitution debate in their hand, and they put this boomerang far away, and they were very confident that in doing that, the problem will disappear like a boomerang. Your eyes are no more able to see the boomerang, but the boomerang is coming back, and it has something psychoanalytic,
yeah, psychoanalytical about it, right?
Yes, it's like the return of the refoulé, of something you silenced and you from a huge oblivion, and then this oblivion, this forgotten debate, or it's not only a debate, it's a very existential claim for a lot of countries, come back right now, and like a boomerang with a huge velocity. They had a lot of power to put it away, but the power now is 10
times over. Yeah.
And now he got the boomerang in the middle of his face, and I think the most important difference between the 70s, 80s, and now is that it's impossible to put the boomerang away another time, and that's one of the reasons is that with the help of social medias but also all the informatical tools, it's no more possible to hide the truth about the constitution of European collections of African art in national museums. And this truth is so shocking and so traumatizing that that it's now completely evident that we, the adults from now, from 2021, we have to act in order to repair this oblivion and to establish a new ethic of relationship with these countries that needs, like all countries, their cultural heritage, or a part of their cultural heritage.
So one of the questions, I'm going to ask one more question of you, and then I think there's at least one question in the chat, but I just want to remind everyone who's with us that if anyone has questions, please just type them in the chat and we'll get to them very happily. But one of the things that, you know, the European countries kept saying at the time in the early 80s is that, you know, that ultimately the problem is, who would you actually return these objects to, right? Like that museums don't have the proper facilities, or there's not the proper expertise to be able to handle these objects, or this or that or the other. But when I hear, when I, you know, as a non-expert, when I sort of look on and see some of the debates now going on about restitution of objects, it you know, the questions of how one goes about making restitution still seems to be an issue, you know, not just like, oh, you know, as a reason, you know, as an excuse for not giving it back, but a sincere question of like, well, who do you give it back to? Which is the museum that gets it? Which is, in some cases, which is the country that gets it? Is it Nigeria? Is it Benin? Is it, you know, that these sorts of things, right? And also, you know, given so many objects, and maybe this is more appropriate in the US context in relation to indigenous objects and the calls for return of those objects, given that so many of the objects are significant, not in relation to a nation state, but in relation to tribal affiliations or clans or, you know, things like that. Do you feel that there's been any progress made in terms of answering those, or setting up ways of answering those questions? Even if we don't have the answers, we know how to find the answers. Do you think that there's been progress made on that front?
Yes, absolutely. I'm completely sure that the debate has given birth to solutions right now. We are after the debate. My feeling is that we had something like the Berlin Wall, is completely known yet, no solution with this delaying and intransparency, etc., for 50 years. And now, and it happens in the last few months, we have a very, yes, the Berlin Wall is fallen in this context, I would say. It's not my metaphor. This metaphor came from the former Minister of Culture in the Republic of Benin, Oswald Omeki. He said 3 years ago when we met him in Cotonou, he said, if restitutions take place, and he was, at that time, he was very incredulous. He said, I think it's not possible. But if they take place, it will be like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the reunification of both of Koreas. It was something, he said, okay, I can't believe it, but if it happens, it's like a completely new geopolitical order, world order of cultural heritage. And 2 weeks ago, Cotonou, the capital of Benin, opened the first exhibition of restituted objects, restituted from France. Yeah. And I think this event was the day of the fall of the Berlin Wall. For the first time, a little country in Africa, south from the Sahara, was able to obtain, after 130 years, from the restitution of very important objects. Object is not the right word, the proper word, because these objects are more than objects, they are subjects.
Yeah.
And you have to speak with them, etc. It's okay, but they the little country Benin, this little republic, was so clever and had such a strong cultural diplomacy with France that it worked. And this first restitution from France to Benin and this very impressive exhibition in Cotonou right now are one solution or one example of, I think, in my eyes, from my point of view, it's a success. It's a complete success of how to deal with restitutions. And I think we don't have one solution for all the cases. The ground solution is to enter in a new ethic of relation, not to say we have the object in Europe and we know how to deal with that, and you are incompetent and you have no museums, etc. I think that time is gone, and you can see it also with the negotiations between Germany and Nigeria, or the US and Nigeria is going, yes, we are inventing solutions, and I think I'm very optimistic in that for that. And it's not only about finding solutions, it's also about being open for things that will happen, but we don't know what. And that's the future of reconnecting objects with their territories or peoples. And this reconnection will bring surprises, cultural surprises. Yes, and I'm completely sure that this way is the right way, the restitution way, and that we, the mankind, all the people on the earth, will have very positive surprises about these forms of reconnections, not only in museums. Museums are one possibility in Africa to show the objects, but in some countries you have groups of intellectuals, of artists, of curators thinking about alternative forms of displaying such cultural objects, and all these alternative forms are have to be born now, and it's nice. It's like a gestation of something.
So there are two questions from people who've joined us today. So let's get to those. Peter Murphy says, I'm aware that the groundbreaking Sara Savoy report focused on Francophone Africa, and that the book Africa's Struggle for Its Art has a broader view, which is very true. You've brought all of these other countries into the fold. And he asks, how important and influential in inspiring the current movement for restitution was Bernie Grant's, who's the British MP's, campaign for restitution of the Benin bronzes in the 1990s, especially with the relationship he established with the Oba of Benin, rather than only with the Nigerian government? Thank you for that question. I was curious about that too, and maybe that was sort of a little bit behind my question about, figuring out where these objects go, because of course, because of the sort of conflict between Benin and Nigeria, right? That is in particular is a kind of fraught history. But could you speak on that? Is that something?
Yes, thank you very much. I could answer your question, Aruna, because I noticed now, I've forgotten to answer this question of where or to whom and a very short notice on that. Originally, I'm a specialist of Napoleon's looted art, and in that time, from Napoleon, we had in Europe exactly the same problem. Like Napoleon took the works of art from the King of Prussia to Paris, and after 7 years in Paris, they come back, and the population in Berlin said, "Oh, it's no more from the King of Prussia; it's ours now." Because it has been nationalized in Paris, and now we want to have, we need a public museum in Berlin. And it was the birth of the first Berlin Museum of Art. And what I try to say is that these negotiations between kings, republics, etc., are constitutive to restitution topics in the history, also, yes, around 1800 with Napoleon, but also now. And that's the reason is the intertemporality between the moment when you take something and the moment when you give it. The borders can change, the kings, etc., can change. And I think it's not a problem of the restitutors to think about what should I do, but it's a very important negotiation in the countries to have internally and to clarify. But this clarification is very important, and also to clarify what is cultural heritage for us. So the question of Peter about the campaign from the 90s is very interesting, because this campaign from the 90s in the UK was not the first one, it was the second one. The first campaign in the parliament in the UK was for Ghana in the 70s, because of the looting of Kumasi and all these golden objects from Ashanti objects in the British Museum and other museums in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it means that the UK has a huge parliament, or a very well-documented parliamentary tradition of campaigns for restitutions. But in the fact that the Oba of Benin was suddenly so important has consequences till now in the debate, more right now between Germany and Lagos and Nigeria, because in the UK the debate is it's not very advanced right now, but okay. And this parliamentary tradition to deal with restitutions is very interesting in the UK, because you have this permanent play or game between the British Museum saying we are not the owners of our collections, we are not able to give back, we need an order from the parliament. It's a parliament, and you have this ping pong play, and it's very typical for the UK. And for me, it's interesting to see how the collecting of African objects in the 19th and 20th century was very national. It was a competition between the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, and Paris was looking to London and London to Berlin in order to have the most important collections from Africa. It was a very national but also competitive logic of accumulating African objects. And now we have something like the Olympic game of restitution, and all the European nations are trying to do it with their traditions. And the British traditions of parliamentarism is very important. I'm pretty sure if the UK is doing something in the next 10 years, it can't be only through the parliament in the UK. And in France, it's not per chance, it's not, it's very, it's typical that the president, Emmanuel Macron, give the order to give back, because we have these very, top-down traditions. And in Germany, we have huge public debates, a lot of discussions for years. And after that, we will have a decision, a federal, I think, a polycentric decision, etc. And in these Olympic Games of restitutions, now all the nations are thinking national, but at the end, the restitution will be a European phenomenon, but in this, in this national way, I think.
I like this idea of restitution Olympics. It's a good image. Orly Malka has asked a question, and that is, she says, "Hi, Bénédicte and Aruna, thank you for this important talk. And congratulations on the new book." She says, "I'm an artist living in New York and have been following your important work, Bénédicte. I've recently been making work on the emptiness needed in these museums as a pause and a proposition as to their function. What are your thoughts as to what you call museum anxiety, specifically when thinking of these museums as entities defending themselves?" And then she's just followed up by saying, "I mean, it is clear that many of these museums who have started to return objects are cultivating another form of manipulation, for example, returning an object but declaring that it's on loan. In a way, the museum's anxiety is constantly thinking of other forms of amnesia."
It's very important. Thank you very much. The idea of emptiness is very crucial, I think, right now, when in that time when we are after the debate, or I think we are in the post-debate era right now, because of these first restitutions, and the first restitutions will bring a lot more of such movement, and we have to think about, yes, what's the point now? And and the idea of emptiness is very crucial, because in the years before the restitution became a consensus, one of the arguments against restitution were, oh, if we restitute, our museums will be empty. And it's, of course, museums are not able to be empty. Museums have something like the need to be full. And a very interesting example is now the place in the Musée du Quai Branly where the very spectacular and monumental statues from Benin were. It was a rotunda designed by the star architect Jean Nouvel in Paris, a very important room in the Musée du Quai Branly. And the objects in this room are now in Cotonou in Benin. And I was very curious to see how the museum will deal with the emptiness of this room. And the response, the answer is, it's not empty. They put a huge, 3 meters or 4 meters high and 6 meters bright, huge piece of a mask from Nigeria, made from, I think, thousands or hundreds of pieces of fabric. And it's so monumental that this rotunda, that I think it would have been a very good idea to let it empty and to say, okay, we are liberating us from this colonial past but we are also losing something, and this emptiness is positive. It can be something positive. No, the museum, I don't know how to say in English, they silence the emptiness through a huge, very nice, but it's too early to do that, I think. And to deal with this emptiness would be a very important skill in the near future for museums. Not only to deal about emptiness, but also to speak about the positive aspects of something like emptiness or yes. Sorry, it was not exactly an answer to your question, but I think your question triggered my observation in Paris last week.
I think that's a lovely response, in fact, and to a really fascinating question. It's true that there's a way in which I think even for even in the US, as museums are trying to, or being forced to, I would say, being pushed to come to terms with their own kinds of, violences and inequalities and, ethics and everything like that, that there is a tendency to do things to either delay, do things very slowly, or do things so quickly that there's no chance for, right? Like it's another form of silencing the debate, right? Like that if, in a way, if the legacy of colonialism is only, if it's just transactional, if all you have to do to deal with colonialism is return a bronze to Benin, that's not sufficient, right? That actually doesn't deal with the larger question that underlies, all of this question of restitution, which is like, what does a country have to, what does it have to do in order to sort of try and come to terms with that past and its role in that past? And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that, although it's a process that's gone up and down and had its own complications over the years, at least in Germany after World War II, that there was an understanding that coming to terms with what the Nazis did, coming to terms with the Holocaust and actually sort of, having those conversations was, a kind of, was it was necessary for it to happen. Obviously, some people resisted and some people, refused, but at least there was a sort of national kind of understanding that one simply couldn't forget what had happened and moved on, that there was some atonement that had to happen, or atonement's not the right word, but some sort of collective processing that had to happen in order. But at the same time, Germany was very much not willing to do that same processing when it came to the violence that was exerted, with that was deployed in African countries, right? Which it seems to me like, it's not like they didn't understand that it was necessary, right? They just refused to see it as necessary.
Yes, and it has a lot to do with pressure.
Yeah.
Who is doing pressure in order to have these memories and to have this Aufarbeitung, like the Germans say. And in the African case, the pressure is rising now. The pressure is rising now, but not only because African people want to have that, but because the youth in Germany, the young people, our children, want to know why we have these forms of racism in Europe until now, and all these. Yes, the racism from today is evidently connected to all these epistemological, physical, symbolical violence from the colonial time in Germany, in France, in Belgium, etc. And in the UK. And I think the society now will have to do this job because our young generation in Europe, but also in Africa, want to have it. And it's a very positive form of pressure.
Maybe we'll have one more question. Margaret Clinton says, I'm enjoying this concept of tracing the genealogy of colonialism by looking into the empty spaces of princely collections, in that we might ask larger questions about the power and importance of museums and art as instrumental to statecraft and international dialogue. I say this as an American who laments the defunding of our public museums since the 1990s. And that is, I mean, that's a really, to me, a really interesting question, and the relationship of this kind of pillaging and the violence that went along with it, not just as not only being part of a kind of larger colonial sort of extracting of wealth and resources, but actually imparting a kind of sense of authority at home, and the ways in which colonial objects, and Margaret just follows up to say, as Louis Kamnitzer says, who's an artist here, and the museum is a school. In other words, it sets an example, right?
It's very nice. Yes, it's a model, a school. Yes, and it's also the reason, I think, why in Berlin, for example, in France, the young people are angry, are furious against museums, but because museums present themselves at schools, but they are giving a lot of bad examples, and not only in colonial themes, but also in Germany, for example, in Berlin, in climate questions. We are building in Berlin a huge new museum, and it would be the most, the most, I don't know how to say that, the most dirty museum in the near future, worldwide, perhaps, or in Europe. And nobody, yes, I don't know why. Okay, thank you very much for your comment.
Well, I think that with that, well, I'm going to hand it back over to Michaela, but Bénédicte, it was such a pleasure to meet you today, to meet you,
my pleasure.
and and to meet Suzanne, who has been here, she says, just in case Bénédicte needed me, but Bénédicte seemed to hold her own. Suzanne, your translation was clearly such a fine one that I actually, as I was reading it, I wondered if Bénédicte had just written it in English. I was, it's such an elegant translation. So kudos for that. But I'm going to hand it over to Michaela, and who I think will.
Thank you so much, Aruna and Bénédicte, for such a wonderful conversation. I got so much out of that. I'm sure from those wonderful questions, it sounds like everyone else did as well. So thank you all so much for coming. You can buy Bénédicte's book on the McNally Jackson website if you haven't already. Or in our stores. I really encourage everybody to do that. It's such a worthwhile book and such an important read. Well, thank you all so much. This is always very sudden and abrupt when I have to end these meetings, so I'm sorry in advance, but thank you all so much, and congratulations, Bénédicte.
Thank you very much, Aruna. It was a very, very nice conversation. My first conversation in English.
Oh, exciting.
I'm very, very grateful. Thank you so much for your intelligent reading of this book and for all your questions. And thank you, McNally Jackson, for having had us. Thank you. And thank you, Suzanne, for your translation. It's beautiful, the most beautiful translation ever.
Thank you. I have to share some of that with the editors of Princeton University Press, but I am grateful.
Thank you so much, everyone. See ya.
Good night.
Bye-bye.